My name's Matt Delmont. I'm a professor of history at Dartmouth College, and I'm the author of the book Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. This book actually grew out of my last book project, which was a project called Black Quotidian, Everyday History in African American Newspapers. For that project, I was looking through historical Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier to try to get a sense of how Black Americans understood different key moments in American history. When I was going through the papers from World War II, I kept coming across pictures and stories about some of the more than 1 million Black Americans who served in the military during World War II. And I was surprised by this. I mean, I'm a historian, I've taught about this topic for more than a decade, but I'd never seen this many examples of men and women in the service of their country during the war. So that made me curious. It's about 7 years ago. That's what led me to do the research that resulted in Half American. The book's title is actually drawn from a letter that a man named James G. Thompson wrote to the Pittsburgh Courier in late December 1941. James Thompson was a 26-year-old from Wichita, Kansas, and it was after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He knew that he and other Black Americans were about to be drafted into a segregated military. And so he wrote a very searching, pressing letter to the Pittsburgh Courier. He asked in part, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the America I know worth defending? And that phrase really stuck with me. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Because what James Thompson was asking was, what did it mean to fight for and potentially die for a country that treats you as a second-class citizen? He recognized the hypocrisy of it, to be fighting for a country that was supposedly fighting for freedom and democracy abroad, but didn't provide that same freedom and democracy to Black Americans here at home. So that is really kind of the structure of the book. I can highlight 3 of the key arguments that the book makes for you. It gives you a good overview of what the book is about. The first argument is that we have to start the story before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Typically for Americans in our textbooks, we start the story of World War II on December 7th, 1941. But for Black Americans, World War II really started almost a decade earlier. If you looked at Black newspapers from 1933, 34, 35, you see extensive coverage of the rise of fascism in Europe, the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany. Black Americans were among the first to recognize the dire threat that Hitler posed, not just to Germany, but to the world. They recognized it sooner than others because they saw that Hitler was explicitly drawing on American racial policies to help justify his treatment of Jews in Europe. And so every time a new policy was passed, the segregation of Jews on train cars, theft of Jewish property, violence against Jewish communities, that was reported in Black newspapers. So average Black Americans are talking about this in the years before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The second key argument the book makes is that we have to take the double victory campaign seriously. For Black Americans, double victory was their rallying cry during the war. What it stood for was that Black Americans were fighting for both victory over fascism abroad, but also victory over racism at home. And so throughout the book, I try to weave together the military aspects of the story, what was happening on the battlefields in Europe and the Pacific, with the home front battles, the civil rights battles that African Americans were fighting here in the United States. Because for average Black Americans, those stories were always intertwined. On the home front side, there were intense racial clashes all across the country. In 1943 alone, there were more than 240 race riots and racial clashes in big cities and small towns and on military bases. African Americans rallied together to form civil rights organizations to fight back and to push for their rights during the war. Really, the infrastructure of civil rights got built out during World War II. On the military battlefronts, one of the arguments I make is that America and the Allies could not have won World War II without the contributions of Black Americans. Black troops were the backbone, the foundation of the Allies' supply effort. If you think about something like D-Day, D-Day just stood for Day of the Invasion. There was still D-Day +1, D-Day +2, and it was really the weeks and months after June 6, 1944 that turned the tide of the war. Black Americans were absolutely essential to that part of the battle because they moved hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition, food, and fuel in those weeks after D-Day. There's a group I write about in the book called the Red Ball Express, a group of truck drivers, Black truck drivers, who moved all these supplies. The reality is almost all the supplies moved through the hands of at least one Black American. Without those contributions, the Allied supply effort would have ground to a halt. Then the third and final argument is that the war didn't end for Black Americans in 1945. They were thrilled to have military victory. They wanted to defeat Hitler and the Nazis like every other American did, but they recognized that wasn't enough. So that whole generation of Black veterans came back in 1945 and they kept fighting. As one veteran put it, they went from fighting in the European theater of operations to fighting in the Southern theater of operations. Many of them became leaders in the civil rights movement, most famously Medgar Evers. He was just 19 years old when his unit landed on Omaha Beach just days after the D-Day invasion. He was part of that Red Ball Express I mentioned earlier. He loaded cargo for those truck drivers. When he was 21, on his 21st birthday, 1946, back in Decatur, Mississippi, he tried to lead a group of Black veterans to register to vote, only to be chased away by a white mob with guns. Evers, of course, dedicated his life to fighting for civil rights, took on increasingly important roles in the NAACP in Mississippi, and kept fighting for voting rights and civil rights until he was assassinated in 1963. Those are the stories that I try to tell in this book, Half American. And I'll conclude by telling you the same thing I tell my students in the classroom all the time, that the stories we tell about the past matter. So my goal in writing Half American is to try to center the experiences of Black Americans, because the reality is we can't talk about American history without talking about African American history. And so I hope readers of the book, people who engage with it, will have a chance to learn a host of news stories about World War II and get a fuller and richer understanding, both about that time period, but also about how it continues to shape the world in which we're living in today.